Boland was the lady who was my father's grandmother, and he was Daddy's father's, or she was Daddy's father's mother. His father was Roscoe Linderman. Now, Ellen Linderman was in Blandville and married John Linderman, who became the judge in Blandville. I'm not sure what years, but she was there because her father was Professor Boland and he taught at the Bible College in Blandville. It's gone now, but it was a very thriving place at that time. And he saw to it that Ellen had a wonderful classical biblical education. Now, Daddy thinks she was allowed to monitor classes, but he's gone and I can't remember why he thought that. But she knew pastors all over the United States who had graduated from the Bible College in Blandville, and she carried on an active correspondence with many of them. And I believe that's why Daddy thought she had actually been allowed to go into and visit the school and monitor the classes. Of course, she couldn't have been a real student there because she was a woman and they did not recognize female pastors in those days. But she ultimately married John Linderman and she gave birth to two children. Eva Linderman, who married William Rust, and then Roscoe Conklin Linderman, who was my grandfather. He married young. He was first sent away to Indiana, where he graduated from their chemical school, which was the same thing in those days as a pharmacist. And he returned to Blandville, where he married a lady, and they had a little girl who lived only 2 years, and she died. I have no idea what her name was, nor who he was married to, but when the little girl died, the first wife, the story goes, lost her mind. I think she may have ended up in the insane asylum in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, but I do not know that to be true. But I know grandfather was divorced from her, and it was such a scandal that he gave his mother all of his supposedly inherited property, and he bought a fine horse and rode west. Now, Ellen stayed in Blandville, and her husband had died, I believe it was 1888, when her children were young, and she ultimately, many years later, married a Tom Pease. But grandfather Linderman left. Now, according to my grandmother, before she met him, he had worked as a gambler on riverboats and did very well, but then he'd lose his luck and he would be a hod carrier, which is someone who carries the things that fill bricks together, and he would carry the bricks. But he was not a mason, but he carried the stuff for it to the people who were masons. And he ended up in her town. Now, there is disagreement. It was either Kansas City or Oklahoma City, but I don't know which, where her mother operated a boarding house. And they had a sign out front that said vacancy. And grandmother was 16 when grandmother who became grandmother Allenback. But my grandmother, Violet, Lionel, Louisa, Loretta, Anna, Marie, Saunders, Linderman, Luke, Tracy, Allenbach. Anyway, she was a girl of 16 sitting on the front porch, and he saw her and he saw the sign, and he pulled up and hitched his horse to the hitching rail and stayed at the boarding house and courted grandmother, and before too long they were married. She was 16 and he was 26. Those were my dad's parents. And then he went to work in the oil fields through Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas. And part of the time he would take grandmother with him, and part of the time he would leave her at the the boarding house with her mother. She had my dad in 1908, and at that time they were living in Louisiana. We have a picture somewhere of grandmother sitting by the water in Louisiana washing her clothes with one of those old washing machines that had a stick on the side of it that you pushed back and forth that made the uh, agitator turn. And then it had a wringer on it that you fed the clothes through, and you turned the wringer like it was a handle that made them go kind of like any kind of a grinder, and it would run the clothes through. It was a very, very sophisticated thing for those days. But anyway, she lived there for quite some time. She got pregnant with what was a little girl. And while Roscoe was at work, one of the local boys knew how terrified she was of rodents, and he got a rat by the tail and chased her around and around the yard with it and threatened to throw it on her. And she became hysterical and fell down and lost the baby at 5 months, which was a little girl. When grandfather came home from work, he wanted to kill the little boy, but she said, "No, I need a husband. You can't kill him because then you'd go to prison." So I don't know what happened then, but I think when she recovered from the miscarriage that he took her back to her mother and went on to Texas. And they did that for quite a long while, and I think his long absences were what led to their separation. And ultimately, they were to be divorced. But he was out in Texas, and he had become a professional photographer, which was a big thing in those days because it had been around a long time, but they had finally developed cameras that were inexpensive enough and small enough to be portable. And so in addition to working in the oil fields, he became a photographer who took pictures with his cameras and made some money that way. And he was in Texas taking pictures when there was a fire in the oil field, and like everybody else, he began to help with the oil field fire to try to put it out. And in the process, he stepped on a rusty nail, which went into his foot. They hadn't developed tetanus shots or anything, and he got blood poisoning, and ultimately he was sent home to his mother, and Lona was with her mother, and Ellen Linderman, still in Blandville, nursed him until he died in 1914. And I think, according to Daddy, she said it was what we know now as gangrene because she had to change his sock on that leg several times a day, and he said the odor was just horrible. And so he died and is buried in Blandville.